Good evening and welcome to the Kuhn Academy for this installment of AP US History, where we're not just learning history, we're making history. All right, this is our next segment in the civil rights movement. All right, um, and once again, I started it incorrectly on the Latino push for equality. Okay, so generally during the 60s and the civil rights movement, you're pretty much looking at obviously African Americans and their push for equality, women, Latino Americans, Native Americans. We're not going to do a special video on that, but it's important to focus on that in your book. The gay rights movement starts to take place. You want to focus on something called the Stonewall riots. That's the big thing that may pop up out of that group. Okay? But with Latino Americans, they kind of are the forgotten group in this, as is the other groups, just because the African Americans kind of dominate the decade. Okay, but the big issue that the Latinos were fighting for was better working conditions. So it wasn't as much the political or economic equality; it was just these better working conditions. All right, so most of the Latino immigrants to this country came as what were called migrant farm workers. All right, now we know a migrant worker. Saw that before with migrant mother. Um, was was basically um, people that were moving from place to place, looking for jobs, working as farmers, not permanently, just doing what they can, moving on to the next job. And you can see these people working here in the farm fields, most of them hunched over. And working in what we literally call backbreaking conditions. All right, and this begins obviously in the Depression, continues with the Bracero program in World War II throughout the 50s, and then in the 60s is when they start to take action against it. Okay, now one of the physical problems that Latinos were facing was the tools that they were forced to use. Okay, because these were like beet and lettuce farmers where you had to get really low to the ground and not damage the root. They had to use what was called the short handle hoe. All right, which you can see here is about 15 inches long. And as you're chopping up the ground, you have to be hunched over, as you can see these guys here. Okay, and there would be, in the 70s and 80s, you would see a lot of older Latino Americans, literally as hunchbacks, because they would spend 8, 10-hour days, 12-hour days working in the field, bent over constantly, picking out the roots out of the ground and tilling the crops and things like that. So they worked to literally have this banned in California in 1974 because it was so hard to use and damaging. So the long handle hoe is obviously what we see today, what they sell in the stores, and that's easier, but could potentially damage the roots more and stuff like that. Okay, so that was one of the issues that they were facing physically. Okay, so so as Hispanic Americans banded together, they formed different groups to start to push for equality. We have the Mexican American Political Association, which started to band together politically and become Democrats to help push for President Kennedy in 1960. So that's when politicians started to realize this group has power, that they vote as a bloc, and we need to win them over and push for things that they're going to benefit from. Okay. Now there's a more militant group that was formed during this. Is what's called the Brown Berets. All right, and this is kind of a mock on the Army, which had a group called the Green Berets, which was there was a movie with John Wayne about the Green Berets, and these were some of your tougher, more rugged soldiers that were starting out in Vietnam. The Brown Berets were a group of Hispanic Americans that kind of modeled themselves after the Black Panthers, being more militant, more physically pushing back, not so much violent necessarily, but kind of resisting attempts for white farmers to come into their land and abuse them, and fighting back against police brutality and things like that. So so Brown Berets were sort of a more militant group pushing for equality as well. All right, there was a group called La Raza Unida, which promoted Hispanic candidates for office. Okay, if we start electing Latinos, we can start getting legislation passed to benefit them. You can see starting in the 1970s, this is a little bit later, in the 60s, we see obviously African Americans having a huge spike and increase in representation in Congress. Hispanics gradually start to increase. We see a much later trend in the 90s and into the 2000s. And Asian Americans kind of staying flat there. Okay, but so Raza Unida was kind of effective, as we can say, since 1977 in getting some Hispanic candidates into office to try and pass more favorable legislation regarding immigration, education, things like that. Okay, the United Farm Workers is probably your most important group. So just like in that feminist video, we talked about Betty Friedan being most important. Okay. Here we're talking about a group called the United Farm Workers, led by Cesar Chavez. Okay, and he was a migrant farm worker. and he wanted to unionize these workers. Okay, so just like the American Railway Union, the American Federation of Labor, these United Farm Workers were going to be a labor union that was going to start to push for better working conditions, right? And because they were migrant workers, they really didn't have much of a say with their bosses, because the farmers would hire them for a couple months, get through the harvest season, and then send them on their way. No health benefits, no paying a minimum wage. They didn't pay Social Security, anything like that. So Chavez organized a group to boycott lettuce and grapes in all the grocery stores. So in the 60s, a lot of people would wear pins that would say no lettuce, no grapes, because this is what these United Farm Workers were harvesting, and they were getting no rights. There were no good pay, no working conditions, and really no recognition from the government. So they felt that if they could boycott, they would be able to force the farm owners to deal with them and pay them better that way. Okay, so Chavez was really important there, and he actually worked very closely with Robert Kennedy during this. Okay, RFK, who was running for president in 1968. And he was very sympathetic to the Latinos and working with their cause. All right, so boycotts was a main tactic used by these United Farm Workers. Okay, unfortunately, a movie came out over spring break called Cesar Chavez, all about this. It looks very good. The trailer's awesome. You see, it's got some big names in it, like John Malkovich. Unfortunately, it is not playing anywhere close to Mundelein. So if you can find it online, it would be great to watch. But there's no way to watch that in the movie theaters. All right. One of Chavez's main partners was Dolores Huerta, okay, who also was with the United Farm Workers. So we start to see women activists at the same time. So she kind of fits both of those bills. And she was the one that kind of wanted to take that plight to the consumers, to let the consumers know what they were buying and how horrible these workers were being treated with the backbreaking labor and the poor pay and things like that. So she got the grape industry to officially recognize the workers as a union, and they were able to bargain, okay, as a group for better pay and better working conditions and things in 1970. Okay, that was her main accomplishment through the boycotts. Okay, so Huerta and Chavez are your main people there. Other things she was able to do is she was able to push for, she didn't do this herself, but she was working for this big issue, was to get California's driver's license exam to be in Spanish, to promote bilingual there. She wanted the Bracero program repealed, okay, because if you remember, this was where the government was rounding people up. We won't say the name of it, but rounding migrant workers up and sending them back to Mexico because they were not here legally. And then they got aid to families with dependent children, which is basically welfare, as you guys refer to it. But this is money given to poor families. She had that extended to California farm workers because they didn't pay taxes, they didn't pay Social Security, so how can the government give them benefits? But she got that included. And then had another labor relations bill passed for them as well. So a lot of things we saw from the New Deal finally are reaching Latinos here in the 60s and 70s. Okay, and finally, a big piece of victory for the Latino Americans, is the Bilingual Education Act. All right, this was to get school districts that get federal money, just like Title IX we saw in the women video, in the form of competitive grants to establish innovative programs for students with limited English speaking abilities. And they passed it in 1968, and participation was voluntary. So if you wanted this money, you could participate in it, but you didn't have to. Okay, offer bilingual education to Spanish or speaking students or people who didn't speak English. But they finally amended it in 1974 to say that you had to provide instruction in English and the native language, okay, of the student to allow them to progress effectively through the educational system. Right. So this is not like ESL, or as it's called now, ELL, where you're teaching students English to be their second language or learned language. Here, you're going to teach them geometry, history, science in their native language, so they can learn the material while they're also learning English at the same time. Okay, because imagine if you would move to a country like Spain or France and have to learn the content of the material and the language at the same time. That's going to be hard. So this would teach you in your native language. That's bilingual education. All right. And the program was, the goal was to get these limited English speaking ability students to participate effectively in our classroom, all right, while simultaneously maintaining their native language and the culture. Okay, so we're not going to take the Spanish away from them. We're going to let them keep Spanish, but also teach them the content that they need to be successful. All right, so this is the Latino movement, or they actually call it the Chicano Movement, all right, of the 1960s. Important to coincide with the women and civil rights movements as well. So thanks for listening to Kuhn Academy, where we're not just learning history, we're making history. Have a good night.